Welcome to How to Commit Journalism, a podcast from the Capital Broadcasting Podcast Network. I'm Ashley Talley, executive producer. At WRAL, and maybe at your workplace too, we're having a lot of discussion about race, about the power of words, about understanding the experience of others, and about listening. On August 6th, longtime WRAL anchor David Crabtree sat down with 4 of our colleagues to talk about their experiences as Black journalists. And the conversation was so good and speaks to so many parts of being a journalist. I wanted to share it here. Here's David.
Have you ever watched the news and thought or said, how did they come up with that? What about this? They missed the point. Often my email reads, did you stop to think about that story from a different perspective? So what's it like to be a person of color watching the news in 2020? What's it like to be a person of color working in a newsroom? In our newsroom here at WRAL. With me are some of my colleagues. Miriam Melvin is a senior producer here at WRAL. While she has produced many newscasts here for the past several years, Miriam has produced our news at noon. Ken Smith, Lena, Tillett, and Gerald Owens share the anchor desk with me and often report from the field. I thank each of them for their work, their insight, and their friendship. And to each of you, sincerely, thanks for making this happen.
Absolutely.
All right, as recently as Wednesday of this week, we had the John Neville story out of Forsyth County. And I wondered to myself, even though that story actually happened long before George Floyd, we had not seen the video until this week. Was our coverage as thorough as it should have been? Could we have done more that quickly? And if so, what would it have been? Miriam, you produce, you look for stories every day. I'd like to begin with you.
Well, thank you so much for allowing me this opportunity to share from my seat. I would say, especially dealing with the Forsyth County story this week, you know, we have deadlines. And I will say that I was very proud of the way that we covered it because we have a limited amount of time. We have to watch the video and make sure that, you know, everything is factual, but then we still have to shield our viewers so they can't see everything. And there's a lot of editing that goes on. So given the amount of time that we were given to review, as well as covering from the family's point of view, which is very important. We can't forget the victims in these stories. So I think that it was balanced because, you know, we've already seen and heard from the officers. And this time around, we were able to hear the family's plea to not let their loved one be forgotten.
Lena, you and I were in this studio together as that story aired yesterday. And I have to admit, I was curious. I wonder what Lena is thinking as she's watching this, because I knew through my eyes, it was hard for me to even speak when Cullen Browder finished his report.
Yeah, I think Cullen brought a lot of humanity to that report. And as journalists, particularly dealing with death, because we saw death unfold on television, it's incumbent upon us to bring our humanity to these stories. These are human beings when we're talking about someone is potentially brutalized by police officers. These are human beings that we're talking about. So we need to bring that perspective when we are reporting. And I, like many people at home, were probably watching that video and just in shock. Watching someone fighting for their life, the same way we watched George Floyd fight for his life, the same way we saw Philando Castile fight for his life, seeing Black lives lost on television over and over again can be exhausting, but it's incumbent upon us as reporters to tell the full story so that people can make the judgment for themselves about what was right and what was wrong.
You know, before we began this program today, one of the people who I had invited to be here is one of our assignment editors, and she could not do it because of work obligations that came up unexpectedly. And she said, I hope you will talk about something you just mentioned, Lena, the fact that sometimes when people appear to be resisting arrest, they're actually fighting for their lives. Gerald and Ken, you both have been here 18 and 22 years respectively. when you hear something like that, you understand what she's saying.
Absolutely. And you look at the video, first, well, we say first, this case in Forsyth County predated the one in Minneapolis, but the first thing that came to my mind was, here we go again. And I should have thought to myself, here we go before. And you wonder how many other cases are out there we just haven't seen yet. I'll be the first to say that 99.9% of police officers, law enforcement deputies do the job the way it's supposed to be done. Unfortunately, we have these cases that get so much attention, and they should. And you wonder if cameras were in every situation, how many we would see.
Ken?
And you know, David, what struck me about that story is that Mr. Neville looks like me. And that's the first thing I thought of as an African-American male. I'm black first and then a journalist. And the one thing that stuck out with me for that story is when Cullen made the point, and Lena just brought it up, it's so important for us to bring humanity in perspective. And the perspective for me was George, like George Floyd, Mr. Neville cried for help. He said, I can't breathe at least 29 times in a 5-minute period. It's one thing to say he said, I can't breathe. But when you add that perspective of 29 times in 5 minutes, here was a man struggling for his life, which appeared to the officers around that maybe he was struggling with them. But you're right, David. That's a man who was struggling for his life.
Miriam, I would like to ask you a question before we go to the first break. Day in and day out, when you see stories come across your desk that are going to be in that newscast at noon, are there times as a person of color you cringe at what we are covering, what we are reporting, and how we are covering it?
Not only do I cringe, but I have to stop and a lot of times pray about how to present it, because we have to, we can't shy away from the truth. These stories must be told. People need to know that this is what is going on. And again, as one of my colleagues said, you know, maybe 99% of the officers are doing the job correctly, but it's that 1% that, you know, they will cost someone their life. And the reason why I cringe is because I'm married to a Black man and I'm raising 3 sons. And when I see these stories, it just immediately does something to my heart. It moves me because I'm thinking, what if this were my child? What if this was my husband? No one knows he's a veteran. No one knows that he is gainfully employed and that he serves in our church. They don't know that when they stop a man. So, you know, I know that these stories need to be told, but, you know, I have to balance it and keep my emotions in check, but they're very vital. Right now, this is my responsibility. If I don't do my job now, then why am I here?
On that note, we're going to take a break. We'll be back in just a moment. Welcome back. We're on the record tonight talking about issues in different communities in our viewing area, particularly communities of color, and what it's like to work in the news business as a person of color, as a journalist. With me are my colleagues Lena Tillett, Ken Smith, Gerald Owens, and Miriam Melvin. I want to cut to something a little different than what we were talking about in the first segment. Each of us spend a lot of time in the community. Before COVID, before the pandemic, we were at speaking events at least once a week, it seemed like, if not more than that. And we develop a rapport with people. We hear from them. They let their guard down. They talk with us about coverage, about what they like, and particularly what they don't like. Gerald, let's start with you about what you hear from people when they say, man, you guys have missed this.
Oh, I get that all the time. And it depends on who it comes from. I mean, we all approach what happens in our community through our own lenses, where we've come from, who we are. I mean, I grew up in an all-black family in an all-white neighborhood back in the 70s. I mean, from day one, I was worried and concerned about the image that I portrayed growing up as a child. And when I see things that we put on the air, you asked this question of Miriam, and she mentioned that she cringes. I do too. But the thing is, people at home, when they watch our newscast and they see a crime blotter that looks like, blackmail after blackmail after blackmail. I cringe at that. I mean, it's death by 1,000 cuts. It's internal. But as Miriam said, we can't ignore that these crimes happened, these people were arrested, and they're charged with these crimes. That is news. It's our job to figure out what's the most important news. We have to put all of them on the air. And what good does that do to the public? I get that a lot. Why are there so many black faces on television when it's a negative story? And I tell them it's up to us. It's up to all of us, David, not just us of color, everyone who works for WRAL to think about that when we put a newscast on the air. But
there are times, and Ken, you have and I have had this discussion a couple of times, that we would bring up an idea. Well, let's talk about the reason behind this crime. Let's talk about what's happening in the community. Let's talk about poverty. And eyes will glaze over in an editorial meeting, and let's move on to something that feels like it's easier to do. That is very frustrating at times.
It absolutely is. And David, that's the real work that I think we as a community, as journalists, will have to get past, because as we look at these stories, they're not the stories that will necessarily, as we say in the business, bring eyeballs to the set, but it's stories that impact our community. I always say all the time, it's the real work for us as a community as we tell these stories is to not just tell the superficial part of that story, the who, where, when, what, why, but actually find out and get some perspective as to why this is impacting that particular community, how is it impacting that community, and what are the solutions to move this story to the next level. And that's so important for us to do.
Lena, when you came here 4 years ago, you brought a new and invigorating energy into the newsroom. Have you run up against brick walls at times?
In the newsroom?
Yes, with an idea that you wanted to pursue?
Actually, I have not. I have always felt that my ideas are welcome at WRAL, and I'm not just saying that because I want to get paid in the next 2 weeks. I'm saying it because this has been a newsroom where I have felt all of my ideas are welcomed, are valued, and are executed. And I have friends, I have worked in this business now for a few years, several years, and I've definitely met brick walls at other markets where people did not find the value in telling a story about a Black life because they thought that it wasn't transferable to our greater viewership, which I think is not true. I think humans are humans are humans. And that means that stories affect us all. And, it is our jobs certainly to find the facts and the truth behind every single story, but also bring perspective by sharing people's stories and showing the value in people's stories and perspectives. I felt valued here, David.
I'm glad to hear you say this. This is something I'm going to put out there to each of you because I would like your feedback specifically to me on this. I remember when the Million Man March was held in Washington. What are we talking, Gerald? Now, 20 years ago?
Not quite, no.
But 15 years ago.
15's better.
And I went to our news director at the time and I said, I want to go. I'd like to see this story told also through white eyes, not only through the eyes of Kelly Wright, who I think covered it for us at that time. Ken, is that right?
This was after Kelly.
This was after Kelly. Okay, yeah. Well, there's my mind. However, that idea was sort of just knocked away and said, no, that would not be appropriate. What was I missing there? Miriam?
Well, it's funny that you would say that. I think that the thought pattern has always been, let's let the person who's the closest to whatever subject matter, let them cover it. They have more intimate knowledge. But I don't think that that serves a greater purpose when you're trying to get the message to a different demographic. I believe that the fact that you want to know and you're seeking the knowledge, you're not just waiting for someone to come and break everything down for you, but you want to be a part of the experience. And that is how we all grow, is being immersed in these situations. And I'm so sad that you didn't get a chance to go. I couldn't go for obvious reasons. It was a Million Man March, but I think that would have been powerful in and of itself for WRAL to be on on the forefront, I would say, of having, a non-Black reporter, anchor, who says to you, we may be different colors, different races, but as Lena has already pointed out, people are people are people. And, we've got to come to the same level playing field and say, I want to seek to understand, explain it to me, make it matter to me.
Gerald?
I agree. And, I wouldn't mind seeing a white woman go and cover that major story. We get trapped into this thinking that only a Black person can cover a Black story, only an Asian reporter can cover an Asian story, and so on and so forth. Deborah and I have had this conversation a number of times. I mean, there are many times we have major stories that have to do with, ethnicity and that kind of thing, and it's human nature. We tend to send people who identify more closely with that ethnicity to cover a story. And yes, we may get a different perspective, but David, your point taken, imagine the perspective of someone who wasn't Black to go to that event. We would have gotten a completely different story. And we do have some forward-thinking management here, and I do want to get paid in 2 weeks. But we think about these. We really give these issues a lot of thought when we schedule either reporters and photographers to go cover these things. And our management is constantly willing to grow in terms of their thinking along these lines.
If I can add one thing, David, do we have to go to a break?
No, go right ahead.
For any aspiring journalists out there who may see that brick wall, here is my advice. Flesh out your story before you bring it to your news director. That's what I do to this day because I learned it the hard way in other markets. Make sure you have the people already that you plan on talking to. You have the facts to support it. You have the statistics to support it. You have all the reporting to support whatever it is that you are trying to tell. That is how, be a journalist, regardless of the story. Be a journalist. The fundamentals are the same for any story.
I was just reminded by another person who I invited to be on the program, who's running audio for this program and couldn't do it, Allison King, longtime employee here, that we had a lot of different people, a lot of ethnicities covering Black Lives Matter, particularly the protest here. We're going to take a break. When we come back, I want to talk about how you viewed our coverage of the protest. Did we get the point of what the protesters were trying to prove or to say, or could we have done a better job? We'll be right back. Welcome back. Just before the break, we mentioned the Black Lives Matter protests that happened here in Raleigh and throughout our viewing area, basically over the past few weeks and months, ever since the death of George Floyd. Lena, I remember walking into the studio one day and we were about to anchor together, and I said, and I'm paraphrasing now, but I said something along the lines, I wonder if this movement can be sustained, basically on what we had seen in downtown Raleigh. And you gave me a very straight answer of how encouraged you were that many of the protesters were focused. They had specifics that they wanted to see changed. And you gave me a different twist of my own lens of looking at it.
Because we have to listen to what these protesters are saying. They might be screaming, they might be saying it in a way that you don't like, but protesters, at least people who are leaders of this Black Lives Matter movement, and that's a tricky term because there's not a centralized group, but people have been working on issues of police reform for years. This particular group, Black Lives Matter, has been working on specific improvements that police departments can adopt immediately, specific reform since Michael Brown died years ago. So as opposed to it being, there's a whole lot out there and it seems like it's unfocused, if you listen to what a lot of the activists are saying, obviously there are fringe people that are doing their own thing, but if you're listening to the people who have been at this a while, they are saying the same thing and they have very specific measures, and it's now up to police departments, up to municipalities, up to city officials to adopt or not adopt. And I think that is what was at least encouraging, hearing the same message over and over and seeing police departments that were receptive to what they were hearing as well.
You know, I was listening to Ken Burns on CNN one night, and he was asked if he were writing his wonderful documentary on the Civil War today, what would he add to it? Not what he would change, but what would he add to it? And this was his response. I would say that I would add this. If you have the same pigmentation as I do, which I do with Ken Burns, it's time for us to listen. And if those who are speaking overreach, if they say too much, if they offend, if they react too strongly, so be it. Let them be heard and let us listen. Ken, are we listening properly?
You know, I'm reminded, David, of something the late Congressman John Lewis would always say. He said he encouraged anybody within the sound of his voice get into good trouble. And I think it's so important that we are listening, and as we listen, don't just hear words, but try to figure out the meaning behind those words, because it's so important, again, to get to the root of what's happening. Because we talk about police brutality, police accountability all the time. We talk about mental illness and how that's a factor in all this. When we look at these stories and we look at the Black Lives Matter movement, yes, sometimes they're screaming. Yes, sometimes some people think they go overboard. But why are they going overboard? What's causing that? When you look back at the history of our country, you have a situation where back in the 50s and 60s, they got into good trouble and they made a difference. And I think today, that's what a lot of supporters of the Black Lives Matter movement are doing. They're getting into that situation where they want to affect change, because I think it's so important that as you affect change, that the future then comes into focus, and you know that there's hope, and that's what I take from it: hope.
You know, inside any newsroom, we sort of live in a bubble. I shouldn't say sort of. We do live in a bubble at times, and we don't feel exactly what's going on in the community the way some other people do, because we have good jobs. People are out of work right now by the millions. Here we are coming to work every day. We have good jobs, good benefits, we're taken care of. All of those things are happening. So from that perspective, last question to each of you, what can we do inside our newsroom to better represent the thinking in the communities, particularly minority communities, to help us all better understand and grow? Gerald?
We have to give everyone a voice. And I've said this to people before. David, the difference between you and me, if you break us down biologically, we are 99.9% identical. It's that 0.1%, skin color, everything else that makes us different. And that's what everyone is fighting over. That's what scares people. People tend to be afraid of what they don't know. Let people know about each other. Open the door, open the conversation, keep it going, and invite differing opinions and listen.
Miriam, I've got a producer in my ear telling me you're getting the last word and you have 20 seconds.
That's impossible. I'm a producer. I got to expound. But what I will say is, it's truly about listening, and not just with our ears, but with our hearts.
Well said.
Wow, she did.
Well
That's
said.
A producer right there.
She knows timing.
Miriam Melvin, thank you for joining us. Ken Smith, Gerald Owens, Lena Tillett.
And thanks to David Crabtree and the On the Record team for this week's conversation. This is How to Commit Journalism, a production of WRAL News and part of the Capital Broadcasting Podcast Network. Thanks for listening.